Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ian Mulheirn. I'm the Executive Director of the UK Policy here at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and delighted to welcome you this afternoon to today's TBI Talks webinar. After Brexit, what does the deal mean for the future of EU-UK relations? Now, we're going to be tweeting today using the hashtag TBI Talks. So if you do have comments or thoughts, please do use that hashtag today. And just a bit of a plug for our future events series. Today's discussion is part of our wider New Year series, and next week we'll be talking about Scottish independence with Ian Murray and Ruth Davidson, and the week after that we're going to be talking about the net zero challenge in the run-up to COP26, obviously an important year for climate change, the climate change agenda. But today it's Brexit and the UK's relationship with the EU. The deal was struck, as you know, on Christmas Eve, the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And of course, it had, perhaps partly by design, it's had minimal legislative scrutiny, but it's also had still less scrutiny and debate around what it really means for the UK, whether it's durable, and more broadly, what kind of a relationship, commercial and otherwise, the UK wants to have with the EU and what this means for it. So that's what we're here to talk about this afternoon. What does the deal mean for our relationship with the EU, and how is it likely to evolve in the immediate term with various things still to be resolved, but also in the longer term, where are we going to end up? And we've got an exceptional panel of experts to talk you through it today, all of whom have been thinking about these issues for a very long time. We'll start off by hearing from Charles Grant, who is the Director of the Centre for European Reform. We'll then move on and we'll hear from Sir David Lidington, who was the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster under Theresa May and her sort of right-hand man for much of her premiership. Then we'll move on to hear from Brigid Laffan, the Director of the Robert Schuman Centre at the European University Institute. And then finally, we'll hear from Anton Spisak, who is TBI's in-house expert on the Brexit process. Now, many of you will be familiar with how these things operate now after many months of Zoom webinars, but we'll be looking to hear from our panelists for about 5 minutes each. And after they've all spoken, we will be opening up to a general Q&A discussion. If you have questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. And I will take questions in groups and put them to the panelists as we go through. But let's kick off. And Charles, if I may, I will hand over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much, Ian. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Good, good. Okay, well, thanks. Let me try and make a few brief points. I think that the question that future historians will really consider an important question on the Brexit process is why did economics count for so little in the Brexit negotiations? I remember a CER seminar in September with one of Barnier's key deputies who said to us, when we talk to the guys in number 10 Downing Street, all guys, no girls, when we talk to the guys in number 10, they say this deal or that will be better or worse for the UK. They just don't care about the economy. They're so fixated on the Court of Justice, regulatory freedom, escaping the regulatory clutches of Brussels. They're just not really interested in the economics. And that's very hard for the European Commission to understand, because the Commission is a very economics-driven organisation. I think, the short answer to the question of why is because they're sovereignists. They're people who really put sovereignty first. But in the negotiations themselves, fish was probably a bigger priority for the government than either the car industry or financial services. It's not just Boris Johnson's government, it's also the government that David served in. When David Davis was Brexit secretary in the early days of the Brexit process, remember he was extremely rude about the City of London off the record. He said roughly the same things that Boris Johnson said about business as a whole a little later. So even Theresa May's government didn't really say financial services is the top priority. And in fact, one of Mrs. Merkel's chief advisors said to me at the start of the Brexit process, if you want a really good deal for the city, we can give you that, but it's got to be your number one priority, and everything else has got to go smoothly, and you've got to agree on the other things. But it never was the number one priority, which, given that it pays about £75 billion in taxes a year, is a bit strange. So I think that is so the result is, because of the red line set by the UK, no customs union, no freedom of movement, no single market, no court of justice, we have a very hard Brexit. I think British people are just waking up to how hard it is, having not really realised, because they switched off for the last couple of years, not surprisingly, because it's such a boring and tedious subject. And we've got a deal that's even harder than many other FTAs have been with similar countries like Canada or Japan, on rules of origin, accumulation, on mutual recognition of professional qualifications, on mutual recognition of certification bodies, on financial services, on the checks that apply to food crossing frontiers, but probably stricter, that the EU's imposed stricter rules than it has on, say, Japan or Canada. I know that Brigid has a different view, so I'm going to just say a little bit about the level playing field. This is my one criticism I make of the EU. I think it went a bit over the top on level playing field provisions. I mean, I think it was genuine and sincere. It really worried that the UK would become a Singapore-on-Thames off the shore of the continent of Europe and steal lots of investment through the Brits cutting social environmental rules and cutting taxes and so on, which is a sort of a legitimate fear and particularly strongly felt in France. But I actually think if you look at the facts and the figures, it doesn't really add up to much. Britain has a big trade deficit with the EU in goods, which implies the level playing field is tilted rather against us. The EU never opened up its services markets properly, which is where the British had strengths. I think the Brexit deal will damage the British economy quite a lot further and make it less attractive for foreign direct investment. But then my real point is political. And again, I defer to David on this, but I think despite the current rumbling from the government about changing the 48-hour working week and changing this or that, the reality is I don't see a Tory party going to establish Singapore-on-Thames. I think too many Tory MPs, and certainly public opinion at large, doesn't want to cut social environmental rules. They have a very low tax economy indeed. So I think the EU rather exaggerated those dangers and went a bit further on the level playing field than it might have needed to do. Finally, I think my main conclusion would be that nothing is really fixed. Britain's out of the EU for a generation, that is fixed. But what we have in the future is very much open to all sorts of questions. I think we're going to be in non-stop negotiation for at least 50 years with the EU. As the Swiss will tell you, they started in the mid-70s and have never stopped negotiating with the EU. I think the 5 key questions will determine the nature of the future relationship. The first one is, will the UK diverge or not? It's this wonderful freedom to diverge. Will it want to exercise that freedom? And again, I don't know. My suspicion is at a symbolic level, it'll try and be seen to diverge, but in practice, it won't diverge a lot. But I may be wrong on that, and I'd like to hear others' opinion on that. Secondly, will it try and improve the terms of the deal? Well, I hope so, because it's a pretty rough deal, as musicians have discovered this week and fishermen discovered last week. I think a future Labour government will certainly try and improve the nature of the deal. I mean, it'll certainly try and rejoin the Erasmus student exchange programme, for example. Whether it goes for a more fundamental rethink and, for example, considers models whereby it could be in some sort of customs union with the EU, I don't know. Keir Starmer won't say that in the near future, I'm sure, but I think he may think about it in the longer run, because manufacturing industry would very much like to be in some kind of customs union with the EU. So I think those are the kinds of issues that will come up. And I suspect that future governments will try and improve the terms. The third question is that the actual style and nature of the relationship. Will we be in constant legal dispute using arbitration mechanisms and employing lots of lawyers to win our case and them doing the same? Will we actually work out a more friendly political relationship based on restoring trust through high-level contacts at a senior level? Again, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that question. Fourth question, will we try and improve the foreign and defence policy relationship with the EU? I mean, this astonishing thing is that the TCA says nothing about foreign policy or defence policy, really, because I should get it right, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, because Boris Johnson's government these days didn't want a structured relationship to the EU because it fears being sucked into the kind of institutional morass of Brussels, and it has an ideological opposition to working with institutions. I think that's not sustainable because we're going to be pressing our face to the glass, looking in, trying to work out what's going on inside the room without having very good sources of information. We're also going to be trying to influence the EU through asking the Irish and the Swedes to speak up on our behalf. Much better to be in the room occasionally. We're not at the top table. We're never going to be at the top table again, but we could be at the bottom table, occasionally given a chance to say a few things to shape the debate. But I think that's in Britain's interest in terms of learning what's going on and influencing the debate. So I think we will move to sort of a closer relationship on foreign and defence policy at some point in the future. And my final question is, David will have the best view on this, is the and Brigid, is the Northern Ireland Protocol stable? I think when we see it being fully implemented, and it hasn't been fully implemented yet, I think a lot of people in Northern Ireland will find it really uncomfortable being cut off to some degree from the Great Britain and tied to a greater degree than some would wish with the South. And I think, remember that Boris Johnson tried to tear up the protocol in September when he produced the internal market bill, which would have allowed the government to override provisions in the withdrawal agreement on the Irish border. He pulled back on that in order to get his deal in the end, thank goodness. But a lot of people in the Tory, well, some people in the Tory party and some people in the DUP in Northern Ireland would love that protocol to be torn up. So is that stable? I don't know. I think the answer to all, and I'm stopped with this, the answers to all those 5 questions I put really depend on what happens to the Tory party. If the Priti Patels and the Dominic Raab stay in charge of it, they're going to be seeking to win votes through bashing Brussels. And I think you can therefore guess what the answers to some of my questions will be. But if those of David Lidington's ilk and even slightly more moderate Brexiteers like Michael Gove are to the fore, then there's a chance of a constructive relationship in the future. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles. That's fantastic. I mean, you've gone through several different aspects of the agreement and what's outside of it there. But what, in your view, are the elements of this agreement that are most likely to kind of the UK is likely to most chafe against and cause divergence, versus which aspects of it have the most potential for building on what we've secured here?
Well, I think the bit that's going to chafe against, I think is the friction at the border. The fact that farmers face huge and fishermen face huge difficulties getting their goods out of the UK for rapid transit into the EU. I mean, that's gone really. I think the integrated supply chains that the automobile and pharmaceutical industries and food industries depend on the friction will be very painful there. So that's an area where I think they'll try and improve things. I think that probably the other thing that I think will make a big difference and is making a big difference already in the short term is free movement of labour. The fact that British companies can't just hire people from the EU like they used to be able to do. That'll create huge strains and stresses, I think, in the future. Those are areas that could be improved. But of course, the EU might, if we're lucky, agree to sort of slightly improve the rules of origin or the mutual recognition of professional qualification. But the fundamentals are set. The fundamentals won't change unless Britain changes its red lines. I mean, we're not going to get back into the single market or the customs union unless our red lines change. I think it can be tweaked at the margins and built on and improved upon. And indeed, by the way, of course, the deal does include review clauses for many areas. So there have to be a review, I think, in 4 years of some bits and 5 years of other bits. The financial services has to be negotiated separately. The rules on data worry me hugely because, I mean, I see David Lidington nodding his head. He knows more about it than I do, but essentially, there's a worry I have of a growing divergence because in Britain, I think, so people of Dominic Cummings' ilk, and there are still some of them in the government, think the whole point of Brexit is to diverge on data so we can have different rules on data, which will, in their view, help facilitate the high-tech industries and innovation in our economy. But of course, the EU is getting stricter and stricter on the protection of data privacy. And so many German politicians and the European Parliament in particular are pushing for tighter rules. The European Court of Justice has already said that the GDPR as applied by British security services is not being followed properly. So I think there's a lot of tension coming in the future. Even if they do grant us data recognition in the short term, in the medium or long term, they may withdraw it. The Court of Justice can strike it down and so can the European Commission. I think data is going to be a very difficult area.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Well, as you say, a lot of these things depend on the political dynamics within the Conservative Party. So that's a good point, David, to hand over to you to take from there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. As far as the Conservative Party is concerned, I mean, the first thing to say is that don't expect there to be a huge appetite to continue the civil war within the party. I think that the fact of exit and the fact that the transitional period has come to an end does bring about a caesura in the debate. And I actually think this goes more widely than just the Conservative Party. The huge appeal of Boris Johnson's election slogan in December 2019 of "Get Brexit Done" was not that there were millions upon millions of British people who were chafing to have a particular outcome. What you did have was millions and millions of British people who just wanted the whole damn subject to go away, so that they were not bothered about it in their news bulletins and on the front pages of their newspapers anymore. And that weariness with the debate, I think, is there in my party, as well as certainly amongst the electorate more broadly, of who, of course, on both left and right, are always much less avid in their political engagement than those of us who have been closely involved in our careers. The number, if you look at the Conservative vote in December 2019, it was still the case that roughly a fifth of Conservative voters had voted Remain in the 2016 referendum. That was down from about a quarter at the 2017 general election, but still significant. And the next UK election, which is due by the latest by 2024, it'll probably be 2023 or 2024, is going to be a difficult one. The Conservative Party will have been in office for 13 or 14 years. That's a danger point, as shown in history of previous long-serving governments, when the temptation of people to vote for a change, to give the other lot a go, starts to grow in attractiveness. And so I don't think that the Johnson government can easily sort of write off that 20%, or write off the demographic shift, which is the more young people come onto the electoral roll, means that more people who on average are going to be overwhelmingly sympathetic coast links with Europe are just ignored. And so I think there will be that to bear in mind, but I don't think there'll be a campaign to rejoin. And frankly, I see no appetite in UK politics, and I see no appetite amongst the 27 member state governments for us to now embark on trying to go through the experience of the last 4 or 5 years in reverse all over again. So I think what we're into is a process of, I wouldn't quite say 50 years, as Charles did. I would say between 5 and 15, where you start to test the possibilities of the TCA, to what extent there is friction there, to what extent it can be built upon. And that the outcome will depend hugely on who is in government in the UK, on what happens within the EU, the dynamics of EU politics at both union and key member state level. Does Macron get re-elected? What difference might a Green involved in the coalition in Germany make to the overall EU dynamic? How do they sort out some of their internal tensions over integration of Eurozone, over Visegráds versus Western Europe, over rule of law and human rights, and so on? So that will all be going on. On the UK side, I mean, Charles quite rightly, in effect, posed the question, sort of, how stable is the UK going to remain as a political identity? Myself, I would argue that Scotland is far more significant in terms of its impact on Westminster and English politics than is Northern Ireland. Just the history is different. The sense of kinship, it's not something I welcome. It is far stronger with Scotland. And I think amongst a lot of people living in England and Wales, there is a tendency to think of Northern Ireland as somehow rather different. And the fact that the UK political parties do not organise, do not have significant support or run more than a handful of candidates in Northern Ireland has an attritional effect upon how Northern Ireland is seen in terms of Westminster politics. And I don't think one should underestimate the degree of real anger that there was among young Conservative MPs, both Leavers and Remainers, over some of the DUP's tactics in the last Parliament. And you saw that in the way in which so many Conservatives walked into the lobby to support the various social liberalisation measures in Northern Ireland at the tail end of that last Parliament. So I think Northern Ireland is going to be very delicate politics. The demographics now roughly 44% each think of themselves as British and Unionist or Irish and Nationalist, 12% or so in the middle. So the Union depends upon enough unaligned and moderate nationalists, thinking let sleeping dogs lie. We really don't want the upheaval, the risk of violence and so on that could come with a narrow vote for reunification, which is all it would be. And and this is a subject perhaps for another occasion, but I don't think the Republic of Ireland is remotely prepared for what Irish unification would bring. Let's say you had a 52 to 48% majority in a Northern Ireland referendum for Irish unification. There would be so many issues, not just fiscal issues, but issues about what happens to Dublin's duty then to be impartial, to respect what does respecting the British identity of a very large proportion of its population mean in those hypothetical circumstances. So I still think the most likely outcome is, even if there were a border poll, I don't actually see it happening in this Parliament. I think that it is potentially very destabilizing, and I think it would probably end up with a fairly narrow Union victory at the moment. If we look more broadly at the other question Charles posed on divergence and where we go from here, I take the view that on most things, what we will see is an effort in London to demonstrate divergence in a way that is politically attractive, but which is not enormous in terms of substance. So for the reasons Charles gave, I don't for a moment expect the government to try to rip up the Working Time Directive. And the idea that a Conservative government that is making a theme of levelling up, that is priding itself on having won constituencies in Parliament that it has not represented for 50 years, sometimes forever, by attacking workers' rights. I just don't see that happening. But I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, they had a look at the CMAP Jaeger judgments on the application of working time rules to people who are on call for particular duties, where it was not just the UK amongst member states of the EU that felt that this had gone too far. I would expect Boris to test some of the state aid provisions, but in terms of we're doing things that are about levelling up and about recovering from COVID, and we think this is all perfectly in order within the terms of the TCA, and we don't have to test it with the Commission first. Well, go ahead and sue us if you dare. Just test some of that a bit. So I'd expect that. I agree with Charles. I think the big risk is on data. It was striking that in the rollover FTA between the UK and Japan, that and Singapore, I think too, that the data provisions were tweaked to become a little bit more liberal than those in the EU free trade agreement. Basically, the UK rollover was just transposing the EU FTA rules into a UK relationship. But data, there are a few little tweaks to make it sort of less constraining. I certainly think that there would be obdurate resistance going far wider than hardline levers to any interference by sort of GDPR with the work of the intelligence services. I mean, that would be a national security issue where you would have huge cross-party support across the electorate for the British government taking a hard line. I think that the really tricky issue is going to be on privacy. And I think on data, as well as on quite a number of other things where you're into divergence or convergence, a lot will hinge on where the debate is apropos the United States and the European Union. And I look at what sort of Underline says, what other people in the Commission are saying about, well, data, digital regulation, overall environment, we'd have to agree globally what the right standards are with our partners in the US. And I think that if you see a significant divergence across the Atlantic, I think that makes it more difficult in terms of predicting where the UK is going to fit into this. If the UK is ending up having to choose between a US or a European model, then I think that the present government would be more likely to opt for the Washington approach than for a European one, and hope that the Europeans would shift. But we'll have to see what Biden actually does when he gets down to the detail on this. I said 5 to 15 years work. Big test coming up this year with the UK presidency of both the G7 and then the COP26 conference in Glasgow in the autumn. I think at G7, Boris Johnson will want to demonstrate he's leading the West's, the developed world's response to COVID, both vaccination program globally and in the economic recovery from COVID. So I think that will be his objective there. The autumn, carbon reduction, I think is a major test, because I think the UK is going to have to confront and talk to Brussels about, look, we're both developing emissions trading schemes. We're both sort of thinking about carbon border adjustments as possible policy tools. So if we go down those routes, and we will on trading schemes, are they actually going to dovetail with each other, or are we going to have schemes that are completely separate, parallel, and where there's no mutual recognition of what the other is doing, which will make it more difficult then to get agreement at Glasgow. So I think there's a risk, but there's a big opportunity there to try to start bringing things together. On foreign security policy alignment, I mean, my own view is no secret that I think it was a mistake for the UK not to have that as part of the overall TCA negotiations. I think that it's a subject that we're bound to return to, not least because Biden is going to want that to happen. Unlike Trump, Biden will value alliances, value multilateral institutions, and he sees the EU as a partner rather than as an adversary. But he's also, the signals are pretty clear, he recognizes the value of the UK as an important ally and global influencer, and he will want to have the Europeans, whether they're in or out of the EU, doing more for security, taking greater political leadership in places like Africa, parts of the Middle East, Balkans, Eastern Europe, than European countries have been willing to do hitherto, or not done effectively hitherto. And he will, I think, be a bit impatient if either the UK or the EU appear, for reasons of doctrine, to be reluctant to get on with that very practical task. And there's apparently talk about some officials in the incoming administration of a three-legged stool approach: United States, UK, EU, working together in terms of an alliance of democracies. Now, with Boris Johnson, he has talked about, in the aftermath of the deal, he's talked about the strategic link between the UK and the EU. Michael Gove has talked about the TCA as the first step in building a special relationship, and that's not a phrase any British politician uses inadvisedly. So there's some, I think, cause for optimism there, but the big test which Charles spotted is to what extent will particularly this British government be willing to deal with the institutions? And I think its mindset is to work intergovernmentally, and particularly through an E3 approach. And I just think that it's not something you just simply have to charge this government with, but I think right across UK Westminster politics, there is a failure to comprehend the way in which the rest of Europe operates on the basis of a sort of continuous conversation that happens within different institutional settings, whether that is the different institutions of the EU, all of them, or the transnational political parties, or bilateral contacts, or the hobnobbing of EU ministers when they meet in a NATO or an OSCE configuration. And that's something I probably didn't realize until I actually was doing the job as Europe Minister. But that, I think, unawareness will take a bit of time to diminish. And I think it's in the interest of both sides to try and keep their eye on the big strategic picture looking forward.
David, thank you very much. Look, just going back to the Conservative Party internal dynamics, which is so important in this. One question I have for you is about the grassroots sentiment, which is really so important in driving it was ahead of the leadership in a sense in terms of the Brexit agenda. And I wondered to what extent you think the reality of the deal is likely to change opinion among the grassroots or soften it. And related to that, in a more concrete sense, can you imagine, or when can you imagine, a Conservative Party leadership candidate winning the leadership? It's one thing to take the heat out of the European issue, but can you imagine someone winning such an election, promising either sort of to have free movement or to have customs union or some other big ticket reintegration move, or is that simply never going to happen now? Oh, you're on mute.
Grassroots first are predominantly older people. A great many of them are over retirement age. So I actually think that you know, there'll be some who would be affected, but I think others who will both feel very strongly about sort of the sovereignty, but also they will be people getting their news from the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, who will, for the most part, present what is going on as a consequence of EU obduracy, rather than, and there's very little real recognition amongst those who are at the sharp end of business, that this is just, a lot of this is just a logical legal consequence of leaving the union and then leaving the single market and the customs union in toto. So it will take time, and frankly, everybody's focused on COVID at the moment. And most Tory people at the grassroots, yeah, they will have views on Europe if they're asked about it, but actually they don't get up in the morning thinking about that first of all. If they get up thinking in the morning about politics, it'll probably be about local planning and housing issues, and about the local schools and the local hospital and so on. Could I see a leader winning on September? Not customs union. I just think that phrase has become utterly toxic. Not freedom of movement. I do think there's a more liberal immigration policy is by no means impossible. And there's some hints that the Prime Minister is tempted that way himself. When he was Mayor of London, he was extremely liberal in his views on immigration policy. And I think that the sort of, not just the collapse in European migration, but the exit of looks about nearly 1.5 million people have probably up sticks and gone from the UK, is going to have, depending on how the COVID recovery goes, a severe impact on certain sectors of the UK economy. So I think that there will be a certain shift towards a more liberal regime, but not automatic freedom of movement, some sort of tests, but actually being more relaxed about numbers, provided people are coming to take work, and probably have some sort of English language requirement as well. And if you look at the polling, concern about immigration amongst the public was at its height from sort of 2015-16. Really starting at the time of the Calais industrial dispute, which was presented in the UK media as entirely about immigration, and then the refugee crisis, so Aegean, Balkans, Germany. And since then, and since the referendum, public concern on immigration has been diminishing. It's now at relatively low levels. So, I don't rule out some movement there.
Okay, great. All right, let's move on. Brigid, over to you.
Good afternoon. Good to talk to you, and it's been a very interesting conversation so far. Let me give you an EU/Irish perspective on what we've seen and on the future relationship. I think the first thing to say is we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the choices by successive Conservative governments and the House of Commons has meant that the UK is now more politically, economically and socially distant from its continental neighbours than for a very, very long time. It is the fact of Brexit and the manner of Brexit is a fundamental shift in the relationship between the EU and its near neighbours. The EU has got the deal it expected. It's got the deal it expected because from Theresa May's Lancaster House speech onwards, the EU understood that the choice of the UK was to leave the single market, leave the customs union, and then following with the Johnson government, that it was a sovereignty first Brexit. And the EU, both institutions and political leaders, got the message. So they have delivered a deal within those limits. I think they would have preferred a deal with a chapter on foreign policy and security, and they would have been much more open to much tighter links. But the UK red lines, in a sense, predetermined the nature of the deal. Now, Charles said that he thinks the EU went too far on level playing field, that it was too concerned about the competitive threat from the EU or from the UK. I think one needs to understand what was the hierarchy of EU interests here. The first was membership had to matter. You could not have an ex-member with privileged access to the EU markets, particularly when it wanted to leave major EU regimes and the entire legal scaffolding. Secondly, there had to be this balance between rights and obligations. And the rights and obligations impacted, in my view, on level playing field. So you could argue economically, perhaps, that the red tape coming from exit from the single market and the customs union mean that the EU didn't have to worry. But the EU also listened very carefully to what successive governments said when they said that divergence was sovereignty and divergence were important, and that the UK would have this glorious economic future outside the EU. In other words, the EU listened and understood. So I think that also we shouldn't underestimate the consistency, coherence of the homework that the EU did and the way in which it collectively responded. It was a meticulous exercise at all levels, institutionally and politically. Now, in terms of what kind of relationship can we see in future, I would say that depends very much on what kind of EU evolves, the EU 27 and how it evolves, and what kind of neighbour the UK will be. And I think the UK government, and particularly this Conservative government, has got to make a decision about tone. Far too many UK ministers diss the EU at any available opportunity. And the spat about the status of the EU ambassador now is just plain silly. But it's not just silly, but it's vindictive. It essentially tells the EU that the UK fundamentally doesn't respect the EU as an institution, the present government, and that for all David Frost's talk of sovereign equality, that really the UK is not prepared to give respect to the institution that represents the vast majority of Europeans. The EU is the institution for Europeans for handling deep interdependence. It is the idea that somehow or other, I think, and it's very much in the British mindset, and I should say probably the English mindset, that the EU is Brussels and bureaucracy. It's not. The EU is the member states and the Brussels system. And I think there's a fundamental attitudinal issue here. And if the tone doesn't improve, I think many on the continent will just shrug their shoulders and say, well, vas-y. So in terms of so I do think tone matters. I think the UK has got to decide to be a decent neighbour, and if it doesn't, it's facing an asymmetric relationship with a group of countries that are more powerful and have more economic clout and will not be minded to be nice. So I do think tone really matters in the relationship in this period. Secondly, in terms of the way in which the deal will pan out, the Commission has now established its unit for dealing with the UK. A senior vice president will be responsible both for the trade agreement and the withdrawal agreement. I anticipate that the member states and the capitals will be extremely vigilant for the first year on how both the withdrawal agreement and the trade agreement is implemented, observed and respected. Because again, I think that I talked of tone. I think it would be important for London to understand that reputation and trust matter as well. And the Internal Markets Bill did enormous damage to trust in the EU internationally, in my view, but also, of course, in the EU. So in terms of, I think, tone, trust and reputation, because Brexit has been a difficult process for the United Kingdom, but equally for the capitals of the member states. On the substance of the agreement, I would say that there will be easements. I would imagine that whole institutional architecture of the trade agreement will allow for the working out of easements and, in a sense, helping the relationship along. But without a fundamental shift in UK red lines, this doesn't get much better. In other words, the economic hit that the UK is taking and may continue to take is the new normal. I think IT systems and digitalization of borders can all help, but I think very little will help in terms of a very different economic relationship without fundamental shift in UK red lines. So I think that when the review of the deal comes in 5 years' time, it will very much depend on which government is in power in London and whether or not they want to engage at a different level. I think apart from that, there will be clearly, I think it makes sense that on foreign policy and security policy, that there are closer relations. I caution against London opting for only bilateral links, because it's fine. I think the UK must up its game in the capitals, because that's an important entree for it. But it can't ignore the EU as the collective entity representing these member states, for whom the EU remains extremely important. So again, I think if the tendency in London is to say, well, all that matters is Paris and Berlin, then that's not going to be enough. So I do think that the UK has finally, now that it has left, got to understand what the EU is. Let me end with something on divergence. Again, I think the member states will be extremely vigilant on divergence, not simply because, again, the messages from London that divergent sovereignty first was the dominant rhetoric that they had in the room. And so if you tell the EU you're going to diverge, the EU expects you to diverge. And they will therefore be extremely vigilant on what divergence, where and how. And then finally, let me turn to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's not stable. This protocol is not stable. But the reality is that Brexit is a major destabilizing factor for the island of Ireland. That once London decided no single market, no customs union, borders were back in play. And once borders are back in play, the question is where. So the only thing that would be more destabilizing of the island of Ireland and Northern Ireland would be a land border on the island of Ireland. And again, why? Because it's not Dublin. You've got to look at the political geography of the border area. It's dominated by Sinn Féin on the northern side. They will not consent. The people who live there, north and south of that border, will not consent to the re-emergence of any visible signs of a border. The genius of the Good Friday Agreement was it removed the British Army towers, but it also made that border invisible because of the single market. It's really destabilizing. It's a challenge for unionism in Northern Ireland. It is most unfortunate that there has to be a sea border, but the only thing that is worse is a land border. So I think it's really imperative that London, Dublin, Belfast, and Brussels make that protocol work. But does it destabilize? Is it perceived by unionism, particularly the DUP, as a loss? Yes. A betrayal? Yes. But to be honest, they asked for it. No unionist in Northern Ireland should have favoured Brexit, because the best way of maintaining the constitutional status of Northern Ireland is joint membership of Ireland and the UK in the EU. So now I never anticipated in my lifetime that there would be a border poll. I fully agree there won't be a border poll this year, next year, 5 years, but there will be a border poll in the next 10 years, 10 to 15 years. And I'm not so sure that it would be, when it happens, a narrow majority for the union. But also, what is really dangerous is that the DUP have now legitimized, Brexit has legitimized major constitutional change on the basis of 52% of the electorate. So you can never, ever, ever tell the nationalists in Northern Ireland 52% is not good enough. So am I worried about the long-term impact of Brexit on the island of Ireland? Yes. I'm far less worried about the economy. The Irish economy is very adaptable. It will find a way. But I am very worried about the stability of the political settlement that was the genius of the Good Friday Agreement.
Brigid, thank you very much. But just quickly, a quick question to you on how do you think the EU is going to approach dealing with the UK from here? Is it, to Charles's point, is it going to turn to sort of legalistic approaches using the arbitration mechanisms, litigation, etc., or is it going to try and help minimize the relationship as a target in the British domestic political scene and try and take a pragmatic approach? What's your sense?
The answer to that is we simply don't know. And it will very much depend on, I think, what happens in the UK. So if the UK opts to diverge very significantly, then I think the EU will use the legal routes, and it will be forced by the capitals to do so. Yeah. If, on the other hand, it's performative divergence, more in form than in substance, then I think you will get the working out in all of these sectoral institutionalized committees. I think they're really important. But of course, there are lines that won't be crossed. So the EU is not going to allow preferential access for the UK to its market.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's go finally, Anton, to you.
Thanks very much, Ian. I thought I would just set out some of the more immediate challenges that I think the relationship between Britain and the EU is going to face. And I think there are three such challenges. The first one is, of course, implementing the agreement itself. We should remember that this agreement and the checks that we are seeing right now are not the full-scale checks and the full-scale impacts of this agreement. There is still a number of issues that need to be resolved in the next few months. We've talked about financial services and the cross-border data as two very prominent examples, but in reality, there is a whole suite of areas where there have been all kinds of temporary measures agreed for a number of months this year, and those will end throughout 2021. So we are yet to see some of the full-scale impacts, and the full implementation of the agreement will just be will just be done in the next few months. The second really important challenge, immediate challenge for the two sides, will be finding new ways of cooperating and doing so in amicable ways. And we've talked about some of the reluctance on the UK side to institutional cooperation. Well, the reality is that this agreement sets up a very complex institutional architecture that will need to be managed on an ongoing basis. And we've written about this many times, but there will be a politically chaired partnership council that will need to meet regularly. There will be 19 technical committees that will need to meet at least once a year. There will be several working groups. So there is a whole institutional structures that will need to be put in place very, very quickly. And in turn, Whitehall structures that will need to respond to what happens in the international arena. But I think the really big institutional question is not all the workings of the committees, but actually is, how does the UK influence what happens in Brussels? Because if we step back from the technical realities, there will actually be quite a substantive body of EU law that Northern Ireland will have to continue applying as a de facto member of the single market for goods. And I've done some estimations on the body of that legislation, and it is anywhere between 200 to 400 new EU legal acts every year. So it is approximately one new EU legal act every single day that Northern Ireland will have to continue adapting. And I don't think anyone in London and in Westminster has fully grasped the reality of that task and what it will demand, both in terms of implementing the legislation domestically, but also actually trying to influence that legislation as it applies to Northern Ireland without having a seat at the table. So that's the second challenge, I think, finding ways of trying to cooperate in sensible and constructive ways. But I think the last challenge really will be about getting the tone and spirit of this relationship right. And Brigid talked about this very briefly, but I think it's really, really important, and we are seeing this just now with the spat over the EU's embassy in London. But it is those unnecessary fights that will get the tone of this relationship right. The reality of this agreement and of Northern Irish Protocol and everything else that has been done in the last couple of years is that it really rests on good faith of both sides to get it done and get it done right. And there is really quite a fundamental choice for both sides, but especially the UK government right now. Does it want to cooperate in a constructive way and be very constructive in the way it treats the EU and cooperates on an ongoing basis? Or does it choose a more acrimonious approach? And if it is the latter, then we'll see a lot of political disagreements and even very complex legal disputes in the next few months and years that will complicate this mutual relationship. So I think that's the note on which I would end, but there is so much more to talk about, of course.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Anton. Terrifying numbers there. Okay, we've got a bit under 10 minutes left, so I'll go straight to questions now. And if I could, I'll go first to Sandra Kaduri, who has a couple of questions, one of which is about the relationship with devolved administrations. Sandra, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, lovely. Yeah, the first question was, what about the capacity for different parts of the UK, whether nations, regions or cities, to chart a different course in terms of their relationship with Europe, bypassing the UK government? Already there's some divergence of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Gibraltar and Falklands, with Argentina making a pitch there. And many cities I've spoken to actually have their own strategies and charm offensives lined up to show they're open to Europe. So what are we going to see with that kind of divergence?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Sandra. And then Richard Corbett. Richard, you had a couple of questions. Do you want to come in at this point?
Under the agreement, the Partnership Council of Ministers has enormous power to supplement and even change the agreement without parliamentary approval. The European Parliament this week has been complaining about that and is seeking an undertaking from the European Commission that it will be consulted before decisions are taken, to have its input before, not just hear about them afterwards. Will the House of Commons do the same vis-à-vis the UK government and have proper scrutiny before decisions are taken and an input before they are taken?
Great, thank you, Richard. Finally, I'll take a question from Duncan Rook, who is thinking more about how the EU is likely to change. Duncan, do you want to ask your question?
Most of your panelists believe that the UK has no prospect of rejoining the UK within 15 to 50 years. What do they think the EU will look like in that time frame?
Thank you, Duncan. That's great. And just to add one further question, there's a lot of questions in the question and answer box about the relevance of the new Biden administration, the observation being made, not least that getting a trade deal with the US is probably just got harder, even if it was ever really feasible. But I'd be also interested in panelists' comments generally on what the change of administration in the US is going to do. So we've got 4 questions, about 60 seconds each, so feel free not to answer all of them if you don't want, on around devolved administrations in the UK relationship with the EU, around the role of parliamentary input to the governance process from here, the Biden administration, and also how the EU is likely to evolve over the next 15 to 50 years. If I go in, how about I go in reverse order? Anton, shall I come to you first to give us your thoughts?
So I'll just take the question of Biden and what might happen. I think there will be a serious effort by the Biden administration to revive the US agreement with the EU in the first place. The Obama efforts to conclude TTIP essentially failed because they ran out of time. And if it will be that will be a real trade priority of the Biden administration, and inevitably it will have consequences for the trade deal with the UK. So I think it's something to watch out, and we'll definitely get a clear sense of the priorities of the new USTR, US Trade Representative, and the Biden administration in the coming months.
Fantastic. Brigid, do you want to pick up on any of those? Oh, I think you're still muted.
Let me begin by the question of what the EU will look like in 50 years. Well, I have no idea about 50 years, but in terms of 15, I think what we see in the EU at the moment is a number of very transformative projects, the Green Deal, digitalization, and Europe's role in the world. And the EU, so the EU has come through this extraordinary decade of crises, and in every crisis there was the assumption that this was existential for the EU, that the EU, if it couldn't handle this, would collapse. Well, I think we need to get beyond that, both in scholarship and in commentary, that the EU is resilient, and we even know why it's resilient. It's resilient because of the fact that it manages both that union of states and union of people with enormous tension, but it's a pretty robust political system. Now, it has really serious challenges. I hope that the rule of law issues with Hungary, Poland, and some other countries are episodic and not permanent, because I think if they last a long time, they're very damaging to the EU. But I see the EU as embarking on those major projects. As always, they won't, there's no utopia out there, so it won't achieve everything that it sets out to achieve, but it will achieve an awful lot. I think the internal challenge is the rule of law, the external challenge is the neighborhood, and how that very disrupted neighborhood and how it handles it. But I think in 15 years' time, the EU will continue to exist. It will have deepened integration, but not in across the board, but in particular fields. And so I think it will be that union of states and peoples that we already have. On the Biden administration, I would say that's a very good thing, both for the UK and the EU. Washington will want a good relationship with London and a good relationship with the EU. Now, for the EU, of course, the issue will be what happens when Biden pushes the EU on China. And what to do about China. But I think that there is a rare opportunity post-Trump to reset transatlantic relations, and I think that's a very good thing. The only other thing I would say on Biden is that, and this is the Northern Ireland Protocol, it is really important that the protocol is made to work, because Washington will also keep a very close eye on this.
Thanks, Brigid. David, to you, with about a minute left.
Right. Rapidly going through it. On local and devolved contact with Europe, yes, it will happen, but every devolved settlement reserves external relations to Westminster, so it can only happen effectively within the limits of that constitutional arrangement. Parliamentary scrutiny, Richard is right. The House of Lords, where the government is in a minority, will do this anyway. I think in the House of Commons, there will be increasing pressure, including from the Conservative backbenches, for Parliament to be more involved, because people will start to see the impact on their own constituents of how the TCA works out in practice. And so I think that demand will come up. The government will try to resist it, as almost every government does, but they'll have to try and find a balance in terms of placating their own benches. The key will be constituency pressure. What will the EU look like? I think in 15 years, it depends on what happens in elections, particularly in France, Germany, and Italy. But you know, if Le Pen or Salvini were to win an election, I mean, all bets are off. But if you force me to put money down, I would say it'll start to look a bit more like Macron's Europe of Circles, where I think the currency union has a dynamic inevitably towards greater integration of economic and fiscal matters over time, and some political arrangements to match that. But there'll be other full member states that don't want to take part in that, or which will not qualify for membership of the single currency. And then Europe's got to think, what is its offer to the Western Balkans and to Eastern Europe if the appetite for full membership is as jaded as it seems to be at the moment? Biden, I think he will be saying to the European allies, and I include the UK in that, that he wants them to spend more on defence, that he wants them to exercise greater political leadership than they've hitherto done, and that he wants to know what they're going to do to help the United States in its prime region of concern, which is the Indo-Pacific. And I think that will make for some very interesting debates, but it also, I think, is a dynamic where the right outcome has to involve the UK and the EU both thinking strategically and thinking of ways in which to work together in this new framework. And just briefly on Northern Ireland Protocol, I agree with a lot of what Brigid said on that, particularly about the risks that there are there and the importance of handling this sensitively. And there was a moment in December 2019 when the new Northern Ireland Protocol was announced, where there were real fears about loyalist paramilitaries reorganizing, and I think we should not, on either side of the channel, for a moment be turning a blind eye to what happens in Northern Ireland. We've got to be on top of the detail of that and how the protocol is working out in practice and affecting the politics.
Absolutely, thanks, David. Charles, final word to you.
A couple of very brief points, Ian. On the future of the EU, I agree with David. I think we're heading for a Macronian European Union with concentric circles and categories of half membership on the edge, and the kind of status that Britain could perhaps in the long run seek to rejoin as a kind of half member or two-thirds member, possibly. I think, as David said, the Eurozone will integrate. I worry more about the migration problem, and I don't see much sign of integration there. But I think the Schengen area could shrink. As for the EU, as for the UK rejoining the EU, I think the EU as a full member, it's not likely, because the EU would say, not on your Nelly, unless you have a national consensus in favour of joining. If Keir Starmer says, I want to rejoin, but the leader of the opposition says, we'll take us ourselves out in 5 years or 3 years, as soon as we'd rejoin, then of course the EU would say, we're not going to touch you. So if there's a national consensus, we could rejoin. I don't see that consensus, except of course in Scotland, there could well be a national consensus. If Scotland becomes an independent country, I think at least 70% of Scots people would be in favour of joining the EU. So that I think the EU would say yes to Scotland. Last word is on Scotland. I've looked a little bit at this. I think if, in terms of devolved administrations, if Scotland wanted to have separate, if it's in the UK, wants separate rules on immigration and visas and job opportunities for European citizens, that's quite possible, so long as London agrees. I mean, London did not agree when Nicola Sturgeon talked about it. But I think if London does agree, why shouldn't the Scots have their own different rules? They like immigration more than the English do. A very, very fine point of Biden, one point of Biden. I think Britain faces a difficult dilemma, because I think the current government will look for opportunities to show it's different from the EU in foreign policy. It's lined up with the EU on climate change, Iran, Middle East, and much else. And one of the few areas where it could actually be closer to America is being tough on China. It could line up with the Anglosphere countries against the EU, which is a bit softer on China. And I think Boris Johnson will probably do that quite soon.
Great, Charles. Thank you very much. Now, we are a little bit over time, and that just after 3, which means my next homeschool pupils will be banging on the door to get in. We can't do justice to such a huge discussion as we've had this afternoon in just an hour, but I think with our panelists and experts, we've had a very good go. It's been a hugely enlightening discussion. So thank you to you all for your time. Thank you to all of you who participated and joined to listen, and for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them. But do stay in touch, and leading on from that last point that Charles made, do join us next week when we will be talking about the Scottish independence question and the prospects for it. But for now, all remains to say thank you very much, and have a good afternoon and a good weekend, everybody.